and YouTube. Let's see if I can figure out this technology here. Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for joining. Okay, so just so you all know, I'm live on Facebook and I'm live on Instagram. So I'm going to kind of be looking between two cameras, but I hope it's not too weird. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah, how's everybody doing? So this is, inshallah, going to be the first installment of the book club, which I am excited about. So, like I mentioned before, for those of you who were there for my first and original live, which I think was a week ago, that I'm going to be talking about this book, which I really, really enjoy. It's called All Things Shining. So if you're joining on Facebook or on YouTube, then you wouldn't have been there because that first live was on Instagram. But alhamdulillah, we're on both now. So if anyone got a chance to look up the book, to get the book, or to even start reading, just let me know. Let me know in the chat, inshallah. Right now I can only see the chat on Instagram. So that's the one I'm going to be looking at. Alhamdulillah. All right. Okay. Yeah. So the book is called All Things Shining. We're just going to get into it because I don't want to take up too much time, inshallah. It's by two professors, Hubert Dreyfus and Sean Dorrance Kelly. And the subtitle of the book is Reading the Western Classics to Find Meaning in a Secular Age. So I first heard of this book a few years back, probably like 5 years back. And I heard about it from a talk between Sheikh Hamza and Dr. Robert George at Princeton. He's at Princeton. I think the talk was in DC, though, at Georgetown University. So they mentioned the book, and it came up in a favorable light. And so then I read it, and I really enjoyed it. And one of the reasons that I really enjoyed it is because, many books written by Westerners who are trying to find meaning and sort of spirituality or religiosity, they end up looking to the Eastern traditions. And obviously there's nothing wrong with that. As a Muslim, our tradition is technically Eastern, so to speak. But this book was different because it actually looked towards Western literature to find these sources of meaning and value that can be useful for people living today. And so I think that's really cool because, we kind of have this dichotomy that the West is secular and the East is spiritual and religious. But this book sort of breaks down that barrier because it's looking at Western sources instead of at Eastern sources for these wells of meaning and things that give us spiritual sustenance. So I thought that was a pretty cool thing to have done. Okay, so I'm going to start off by just sort of talking about what the book asserts. So the book essentially asserts that in the modern time, we have so many choices. And obviously, there's a lens in which to see that as a positive thing when it comes to, choices related to our survival, right? Like what we're going to eat and where we're going to live, right? You'd much rather have choices than not have choices, right? You'd much rather be the person who has a choice over what they eat than the person who's so impoverished that they don't have a choice over what they eat, right? You'd much rather be the person who has a choice over their shelter, right, and where they can stay and how they can live than the person who is too impoverished to have any choice about where he or she can live, right? So from that lens, having choice is a really positive thing. On the other hand, the trouble with having a lot of choices, one is that it can lead to a lot of indecision, right? So when you have so many choices, then you have just that, so many choices and so many options, and your whim and your desire can take you in so many different directions. The other problem with having choices in the modern day is that we've lost a sense of on what basis we should choose things. And what they mean by that is the modern world is no longer religious. It's no longer religious in the sense that, even if you as an individual are religious, the culture is not religious. The culture is not grounded on a religiosity or a belief in God as previous cultures and societies were, right? So there was a time in our human past, in our human history, not all that long ago, in which you sort of took for granted that God was at the center of your life and that God was at the center of your society and your culture, right? And everyone was sort of in on the same understanding, right? That God and religion is the foundation and it's at the center. Nowadays, we take that for granted, right? We live in secular societies, and the whole thing with living in a secular society is that God is no longer at the center. God is pushed to the margins, right? And so when God moves from the center to the margins, you're left with this gaping hole in the center, or you're left with a society that doesn't have a foundation, a strong foundation. And then you have the trouble of people who have lots of choices, but don't have a foundation or standard by which to choose. And so then what do you do, right? And the thing is that people are often left with a sense of emptiness, right? Because when you don't have something that is the standard by which you can decide how to live your life, or you don't have a strong foundation, or you don't have a goal, right? Some sort of transcendent goal to which you're aiming, then you suffer. And I think what's interesting is that oftentimes people will try to act like they're not suffering without God in their lives, right? They'll try to act as though they don't need God or they don't need religion to have a fulfilling life, right? But as religious people, we would say the opposite. We would say that you absolutely need to have God, you need to have religion, and you need to have spirituality to have a fulfilling life. And so what you do end up having in modern society is that you have nihilism, right? And nihilism is basically the idea that there's no basis on which to choose one thing over another, right? No one choice is better than another choice. And you can see how this is sort of a dangerous concept, right? Because it assumes that there's no moral underpinning, right? If you're saying there's no basis on which to choose one thing over another, right? That every choice is equally fine, equally appropriate, then you're saying that there's no moral compass, no moral choice, no moral direction. And so you can see how a mentality like this could be very detrimental and dangerous and really very negative, very problematic. So in this book, that's what they argue. They argue that essentially, we pushed God from the center to the margins, right? And without a center, things can't be held together. And so people really suffer, and society suffers, and culture really suffers. And so, what's interesting about this book, like I said, is that they use Western literature to talk about the sacred and reclaiming the sacred. And one of the things that they really utilize is mythology. So, the myths of Homer. And this was really fascinating for me because all throughout my education, Western classics really figured prominently for me. So I went to, for instance, a a high school that was this really quirky high school where we studied Latin as a language instead of studying Spanish or French. And as you probably all know, Latin is a dead language in the sense that no one speaks Latin, right? But of course, it's a very important language from a historical standpoint because, some of the origins of Western culture and Western civilization come through, this the Roman heritage, right? And so if you study Latin, then you're connecting to that and you're trying to sort of reclaim the origins of Western civilization and the best of Western civilization. And so along with that, we also studied mythology, right? And so, mythology is something very interesting. I think everyone who attends a Western school has some literature class in which they study some mythology, right? So you study mythology of the Greeks and the Romans and the ancient Egyptians. And one thing that's always implicit or explicit is that these stories are fake, right? These stories are fake. They're not real. They're just sort of made up. And you have this understanding that, okay, these people kind of had some silly beliefs, right? Is basically what you come to know about them when you're studying in school. Hey, Jesus, assalamu alaikum. That all seems fine and dandy at first because you're reading these stories and you're thinking too, like, this all sounds pretty crazy. These different gods who these different gods who have all these various powers, and some have more power than others, and they're fighting with each other, and they're helping different people, different groups win wars or whatever the case may be, right? It all sounds sort of made up, right? And so, okay, that's fine. The problem, though, is that there's an agenda behind this idea that all of these stories are just sort of made up and they're trivial. And the agenda is a secular and atheistic agenda, right? Because first it tells you that these stories with these multiple gods, these are all false stories, false narratives, things that people made up to comfort themselves or entertain themselves or whatever. But the same argument that is made to say that those stories are fraudulent are then used to say that the stories of monotheists, of Christians and Jews and Muslims, are also fraudulent. And so you have this very sort of tricky, subtle, manipulative thing where, you're a Muslim or you're a Christian in a classroom and you're learning about this mythology and you're being taught, whether implicitly or explicitly, that this is all false and fraudulent because these stories are so fantastical. But then the same arguments that they use to delegitimize those stories are used to delegitimize our own stories as monotheists, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're a religious person, if you're a spiritual person, if you're someone who believes in God, then you do believe in some fantastical things, so to speak, right? You believe in the supernatural. You believe in, angels and demons, and you believe in an afterlife, and you believe in many things that would not be considered, quote unquote, scientific, right? And so there's this sort of slippery slope where at first they're saying that these stories with these, ancient Greeks and ancient Romans are false, but it's also a very clever way to eventually delegitimize the stories of people who have monotheistic faiths. And so this is something that I began to think about some time ago, and I thought to myself, what is the better alternative? Because I, as a Muslim, am certainly not going to say that the stories of the Greeks and the Romans are true stories, right? Obviously, theologically, we would not agree with them. But is there some middle ground between saying that these stories are just completely false and there's nothing of value in them, and saying that they're true and real. And I think the middle ground is, what were they trying to communicate, right? What were they trying to get across? What was the point of all of it? And I think when you look at them as stories that are meant to teach lessons and are meant to speak on these perennial truths of life, then they can be actually quite beneficial and quite fruitful for us. Okay, so let me start or continue with a quote from the book. So he says, "Anyone who wants to lure back the shining things, to uncover the wonder we were once capable of experiencing, and to reveal a world that sometimes calls forth such a mood, anyone who is done with indecision and waiting, with expressionlessness and lostness and sadness and angst, and who is ready for whatever it is that comes next, anyone with hope instead of despair, or anyone with despair that they would like to leave behind, can find something worthwhile in this book." I'm going to read another quote. So they say, "The sense of certainty is rare in the contemporary world." And I think, I think we all sort of know that to be true, but of course it's especially true this year, right? Certainly the pandemic has made it so that all of our lives have changed, right? Whether in small ways or in big ways. And there is an underlying uncertainty that has existed for this entire year, but really it's just been heightened in this year. And then he says, "Indeed, modern life can seem to be defined by its opposite, so to be defined by uncertainty. An unrelenting flow of choices confronts us at nearly every moment of our lives, and most of us can admit to finding ourselves at least occasionally wavering. Far from being certain and unhesitating, our lives can at the extreme seem shot through with hesitation and indecision, culminating in choices finally made on the basis of nothing at all." So this goes back to what he was saying, right? What we were saying in the beginning is that when you have a society that takes God from being the center of the society to being on the margins, the periphery of the society, you're left with a gaping hole, right? And as religious people, just because we have personal faith does not mean that we too aren't impacted by the secularism in our societies. And I think the whole enterprise of secularism makes it so that no one is untouched by it, whether you're personally religious or not, right? The fact that your society and your culture no longer subscribes or ascribes to the idea that God should be at the center or that God should be the foundation, it impacts you, it affects you, whether you're personally religious or not, because that is the effect of having a secular society, right? Which is different from simply having a secular person who chooses to not have God at the center of their society, of their life, but to make it so that it's the entire society that has had the foundation of religiosity and spirituality, shaken and moved from under it. It affects you whether you're religious or not in your own personal faith. Then he goes on to say, "Many will point out that the freedom to choose is one of the great signs of progress in modern life." And we can't deny that, right? So the freedom to be able to decide where you're going to live, decide what you're going to eat, those are choices that none of us would ever want taken away from us, right? However, we often find ourselves with such a variety of choices, right? Such an expansiveness of choices, and yet we fail to see on what standard we should choose, right? We fail to see how we should choose one thing over another. How are we deciding? How are we deciding, right? And so again, this goes back to the point that whether you are personally religious or not, if you're living in a society that is secular, you will be impacted by that, right? Because as religious people, we still fall into the category of people who seem to lack decisiveness, right? Lack decisiveness in our actions. And that's because the center has been removed, right? And without the center, things can't really be held together. And then he says, there are at least two kinds of people who manage to avoid the contemporary burden of choice. And I think this is really interesting. But he says they avoid it in the wrong way. So the first kind of person is someone who is essentially arrogant, right? So they're very self-confident and prideful, sometimes to the point of self-delusion, right? So they rely so much on themselves. They have such an inflated sense of self that they use that to be self-directed, right? They use that for their own ambition, right? And that is the case no matter what the circumstances of life are around them, right? And so that's how it can lead to delusion. Because if you're so self-confident, right, if you're so prideful and you draw all of your confidence from your own self, then it really doesn't matter how things shake out around you, because you will still walk around with an inflated sense of self. And so this is interesting because this is essentially, Shaitan in our tradition, right? Who's known characteristically for his arrogance and his pride, right? And his self-directedness, his ambition, which flies in the face of what God clearly wants, right? So he turns his back on what God desires. He follows his own desire, right? He follows his own will, his own thinking. And even though it becomes evident that he's wrong, he doubles down, right? And so this is the arrogant, prideful person that even when it's clear that things are not as they thought it to be, they double down, right? Because their pride is only drawn from themselves. It's only drawn from themselves. And then he says the second way to avoid the contemporary burden of choice is to have really no choice, to essentially be someone who's driven by their obsessions and their addictions, right? So this would be the person who is constantly succumbing slavishly, right, to their desires, right? So someone who's overcome by their hawa, right, is what we call it in the tradition. And for that person, they avoid having to make choices because their desires and their obsessions and their addictions make those choices for them. And so these two people, the author says, the arrogant person and the one who is, in slavish bondage to their own desires, both of them avoid having to make choices. But they do it in the wrong way, right? Because we don't want to be the person who's so arrogant that no matter what happens around them, they can still proceed because they're so caught up in themselves, right? That they don't need reality to affirm them or not, right? They're still going to go on and do what they want to do. And then we also don't want to be the person who has, who sort of overcome the burden of choice because they have given into their obsessions totally and completely, right? We don't want to be either one of those people. Okay, and then he goes on to say, let me pick out another good quote. Okay, so then he says, it's always been difficult in certain situations to act in accord with the standards for living well. The Greek philosophers called this difficulty akrasia, or weakness of the will. It is the inability to do what we know to be the right thing to do. So he talks about this here because he's contrasting our modern society to societies of the past. So in our modern society, right? Like I said, we have so many choices, but we lack a standard upon which to choose, as opposed to previous societies where not only did they have, let's say, less choices in some regards or in many regards, but they also had a very clear standard upon which to choose, right? God was at the center of their lives. God was at the foundation of their lives. And so it was always, somewhat obvious what it meant to live a good life, what it meant to live a meaningful life, right? As opposed to today, where it's much less obvious for people what it means to live a meaningful and good life. But he says it's always existed that people sometimes have weak wills, right? They're not able to rise up to the standard. So that's always been the case, whether it's today or whether it's 1,000 years ago, that there were people who weren't able to, summon the spirit that they need to live in accordance with what they know to be good and true. Okay, so we're almost done with the first chapter. Okay, so he says, Nietzsche, the great German philosopher of the late 19th century, famously claimed that God is dead. What he meant by this is that we in the modern West no longer live in a culture where the basic questions of existence are already answered for us, right? So he's explaining that very famous quote of Nietzsche, that God is dead, meaning that the idea that you would live your life in accordance to what God wants for you is dead. That idea is dead. It's no longer taken for granted. It's no longer assumed that the right way to live is in accordance with the will of God. Okay. Then he says, to say that we live in a secular age in the modern West is to say that even religious believers face existential questions about how to live a life. So this is what we were saying before, that if you live in a secular society, you're going to be touched by that society, whether you're personally religious or not, right? That's the whole idea of a society being based on secularism, right? That it's not just individual people here and there who are secular or who do not see that God should be at the center of their life. No, it's the entire culture that is based on the idea that God has been moved from the center to the margins. And so whether you're personally someone of faith or not, you are going to be impacted by that society's secularism. You're going to be impacted by the indecision. You're going to be impacted by the nihilism. You're going to be impacted by the idea that there's no right way to live, right? You're going to be impacted by that. You're going to be touched by that. Then he says the idea that there is no reason to prefer any answer to any other is called nihilism. And Nietzsche thought this the better description of our current condition after the quote-unquote death of God, right? So the idea that there's no reason to prefer one way to live over another, right? So this is all talking about the philosophy that undergirds our modern era, right? So he's just talking about what is. He's not saying what should be. He's saying what is right now is that we live in a society in which God has been moved from the center to the margins, right? We live in a society in which it is not clear on what basis we should live our lives. We live in a society in which it's not clear what it means to live a meaningful life, right? And then he has a quote here from Dostoevsky where he says, if there is no God, then everything is permitted, right? And he was saying that in a mournful way. If there is no God, then everything is permitted. And we have a similar saying attributed to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam that, if you don't believe, then do whatever you want. It's not giving permission for people to do whatever they want, but it's an understanding that without God, people have no clear basis on which to decide how best to live their lives, and they can decide based on their own whim, their own fancy, their own limited intellects about what is best and what is not best. Okay, and then as a wrap up to this, so the authors of this book don't necessarily believe that monotheism or any particular religion is the best one, right? So they're not here to claim that Christianity or Islam or Judaism is the best religion by which to live in accordance with. That's not their aim. So we have to understand that going into reading the book. But what they are certain of is that a society in which nothing is sacred anymore is a society that's not sustainable for human beings, because human beings crave meaning. They just do. And so when you have a society that says nothing is more meaningful than anything else, people will suffer. And I think a really good example of this, and I'll wrap up here, and if anyone wants to leave something in the comments, please feel free to do so. Again, the book is All Things Shining. It's by Hubert Dreyfuss and Sean Dorrance Kelly. And yeah, so I'll wrap up with this, which is that some of you may know the author. He passed away, unfortunately, but he wrote a number of really interesting books, and he's considered sort of one of the best, modern authors, at least by his peers. His name is David Foster Wallace, and so he wrote this commencement speech. It was a commencement speech for Kenyon College, which I think was his alma mater. And he delivered it, and when he delivered it, he was already a famous author at that point and very accomplished. Obviously, it's not easy to become a famous author. That's a very difficult world to break into. But anyway, he wrote this commencement speech. He delivered it. It's called This is Water. And so, and the authors talk about this particular author, the authors of this book, talk about David Foster Wallace. So that's why I'm bringing him up now. So David Foster Wallace, he wrote This is Water, and it's a really, sort of beautiful commencement speech about how you should live your life with compassion and kindness towards other people, and you should always assume that that you don't know the struggles of somebody else, even if it's a stranger, and so you should approach them with kindness and compassion and all the things that you would want to be approached with. And he delivers it in this, sort of funny way, impactful way. And it's a beautiful little message. Now, I remember the first time I read this speech, I was in high school. I think I was either a junior or a senior. And we read this in our small English class of like 5 people. We read the speech together, and we talked about it for a while. And then our English teacher hands us an article from like the New York Times or one of these papers, because we were living in New York. And halfway down the article, we find out that that author, David Foster Wallace, had committed suicide just like a year prior. And we had just been reading his work, right? And so this was sort of shocking for us, one, because we were only like 17 years old. So the idea of suicide was something very foreign and shocking to a 17-year-old. And it was also shocking because we didn't know that going into reading his work, right? And then the third level of shock is that, what he wrote was very, kind and forgiving and compassionate. And it didn't read like someone who was troubled. It didn't read like someone who was having issues and struggles in his own life. But one thing that we discover later, and which the authors of All Things Shining talk a lot about, is that the problem with Wallace's worldview And it seems like Wallace even understood this. The problem with his worldview is that it wasn't based on anything, right? So the idea that you should live with compassion, the idea that you should assume the best of other people, and that we should live together and coexist and all of that, it's a beautiful message. But it was a message that was drawn simply from his own personal experience, right? His own life experience. It wasn't a message that had any religious basis. It wasn't a message that was based on anything transcendent or anything beyond himself. It was just sort of accumulated life wisdom. And that's nice and that's good. But there's no foundation to that except his own individual life, right? There was nothing transcendent to the message, and there was nothing transcendent to where he was, to what he was drawing from to create that message. And one thing they talk about in this book is that becomes really shallow. That if you're only drawing from your own life experience, if you're only drawing from your very limited intellect, right, to create this idea of what it means to live meaningfully, you're just not drawing from something powerful enough, right? We're all limited. We're all flawed, right? We're all weak. We're all incomplete. And so the idea that you could simply philosophize for yourself the best way to live your life, and then that would be enough for you, and that you wouldn't need any sort of religion or standard, it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And so that's one reason, that's one thing people philosophize about with this particular author, is that he did sincerely believe that life without meaning is not worth living. He just couldn't figure out where to draw that meaning, right? And he lived in a culture and at a time, this is not too long ago, but we're talking like the 80s and the 90s. And, you know, he was living in a circle, in an environment that was secular and agnostic and atheistic, and that did not believe that God should be at the center of anything, that was very skeptical. And, you know, so he couldn't get himself to the point of believing in a transcendent power. But what he did find was that it wasn't enough to live life without a transcendent understanding of life, right? And even though he couldn't get himself to the point of believing that, he understood that life without that transcendence was empty and was filled with suffering, right? And so, you know, unfortunately, he ended his life. But, you know, he left us a great lesson in how he lived and in his writing. And he sort of, you know, left a sort of a damning message of the age that he lived in, a damning note about the age that he lived in, which is that, no, it's not sufficient to live life without meaning. No, it's not sufficient to act like you can philosophize on your own what the best way to live life is, right? Human beings are amazing and wonderful, but we're still limited and we're still flawed, and we're still incomplete, and we need something transcendent to hold on to. Someone said, okay, someone has a question there. I don't quite understand it. If you want to rephrase it, please do. But yes, the standard by which we live our lives, obviously, as Muslims, is that we believe in the one God, and we believe in his transcendence, and we believe that he created us and that he sustains us in every moment of our lives. We believe that he wants the best for us. And these are all things that are nourishing for the soul. And without that, there is a lot of suffering and indecision. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up. 6:45. Thank you to everyone who joined. If you want to get the name of the book again, it's All Things Shining by Hubert Dreyfus and Sean Dorrance Kelly. It's a great little book. I think you can find it on Kindle if you want to read along. If not, you don't have to. I'm going to be pulling quotes from it, and it's about some really big ideas, so we don't need to go into the details. And it's not fiction, so you're not going to miss out on the plot or something like that. But thank you to those who joined. I really, really appreciate it. And I'll be back next week, Wednesday, inshallah. Subhanallah wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.